You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, news and gossip, with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today, we are looking at TV Westerns. And now, here's Julian, Arthur, and Steve.
Hey guys, what a topic. What a topic. And I'm going to immediately bow to Julian because Julian, unlike the others of us, he was actually on a Western show.
Yes, I was 7 or 8 years old and went to CBS with my dad to be on a show called The Sheriff Bob Dixon Show, also known AKA as the Chuck Wagon. And on this show, Sheriff Bob, who probably was never west of the Mississippi because he grew up in Connecticut and was an announcer. He wore Western garb and he asked us questions, and he then gave me a bow and arrow with a rubber tip in order to shoot a target, and then I would win a prize. So the first shot I didn't hit the target. I almost hit the people on the camera. And the second one was awful, and finally they put magic glue, said his deputy, magic glue on it, and I hit a target, won a shirt. But here was the thing about Sheriff Bob Dixon. His closest friend in the world was Edward R. Murrow. Amazing. I mean, you just wouldn't kind of put this together, that old Sheriff Bob and Edward R. Murrow were buddies. So much so that when Edward R. Murrow was in the hospital, sadly dying from a brain cancer, he asked Bob Dixon to get him out. They're not letting me out. You got to sneak me, get me out of here. I want to die in my home. And Dixon came and did it. So that's my story of Sheriff Bob Dixon, Edward R. Murrow, and a rubber tip.
Did he do that on horseback, Julian?
No. He had a horse, though, on the show that he brought in, Arthur. It was a pony.
And did Sheriff Bob smoke?
I didn't see Sheriff Bob smoke. I think that was Edward R. Murrow's big thing. Anyhow,
Yes.
Guys, I'd be interested to know of the two of you, what was the first Western show you saw that really meant something to you?
I would probably have to say, looking back, and I don't know this definitively, Rin Tin Tin, The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin for a 6 or 7 year old boy was probably a big deal. I think that about the same time I had seen Old Yeller, which was a big deal back in 57, I believe. That was the movie where you're crying your eyes out at the end. Big impact. And that coincides with the just plethora of Westerns that were popping on. I read that there were as many as 50 Westerns in prime time at any given time during this high point. And I think Westerns had an appeal to me as a little kid because they were just fun. They were just fun. Guys on horseback shooting at each other, cowboys. And in those days we said cowboys and Indians. Now we say cowboys and Native Americans. Nothing was very PC in those days. What about you, Arthur?
Well, I was a fan of the Lone Ranger on radio. So when the Lone Ranger went on television, I thought it was great. Love the Lone Ranger. The ending was always the same. And I always loved the ending where somebody would say to us, who is that guy? Who was that man?
Who was that masked man?
Who was that masked man? The man with the silver bullet. The mask was great. Tonto was great. Jay Silverheels, every time I'd see him in another movie, and sometimes he'd be in a movie as a kid, I said, that's Tonto, As a kid, in my family, we had a lot of older people as a child living in the Bronx and stuff. And one of my aunts, they called her Tanta in Yiddish. That means aunt, Tanta. So as a little kid, I would see Tonto and get confused. I had Tonto is that Indian guy, and Tanta It didn't work. It didn't make sense. Westerns were, I got to like some Westerns later on. Being in a gym and riding a recumbent bike and watching Bonanza, which I never saw when I was younger, or Gunsmoke. They were great shows. I could see why they were so successful. Those things ran for years.
Gunsmoke was the longest running Western in history, and Bonanza was second.
Gunsmoke. If you watch them, you realize that they're really well done shows.
Gunsmoke, 20 years. Gunsmoke on the air, 20 years, 635 episodes.
Wow.
And those were the years when they were doing 30 episodes a year. I mean...
39, Steve.
39.
And 13 reruns.
And Bonanza ran 430 episodes for 15 years. I mean, if these days a show's considered a magnificent success if it runs 5 seasons, because then they can put it into syndication. Although the number of episodes today for a series has dipped considerably. Part of the reason there were these recent Writers Guild strikes, some series run 12 episodes.
Or less. It could be 8 and 10.
Yeah.
But that's often...
And then they take time off too. They'll do 2, and then there's 4 weeks where you don't have them, or 6 months, and then they bring them back. I once Don Rickles on one of the Dean Martin roasts. One of the people on the dais was Lorne Greene, and Don Rickles said, "And here is, Lorne Greene, Pop Cartwright or something. This man is Jewish. No Jew rallies horses." And did a whole routine in that. Lorne Greene, the characters were great on these shows. That's part of the reason why they work so well.
I wanted to ask the bigger question. Why do you think Westerns on television were so popular in the 50s? What was it about the Western that made them virtually take over television with few exceptions?
Well, same thing as Western movies were very popular, always popular, and still would be if they made the right movie. There's always been great Westerns. The public has a love affair with the West, however mythical it may have been, but it was mythical.
It's true. And the early days of television, they were using monogram Westerns that B movies. Republic made 50 some odd, and so it was cheap to put it on, and that's what they did. The one I remember the most that made the most impression on a little boy was Hopalong Cassidy. Hopalong Cassidy was on for 5-6 years, but they were cut down movies that William Boyd had made in the 30s and 40s. He then went out and bought the negatives, and then sold them to NBC. It was interesting. He was called Hopalong because he was shot in the leg and had to hop along.
Julian, it's amazing. I made a list of all these Western shows, and I forgot Hopalong Cassidy, or Hoppy, as we called him as a kid, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Hoppy. And here's the thing. He was on the cover of Life, on Look, on Time magazine, and he sold everything in merchandising. This George Lucas had nothing on Hoppy. This guy sold lunch boxes. A company called Atlantic, Aladdin had put out they'd put out 50,000. They'd sell 50,000 a year. They got Hoppy. They did 600,000 lunch boxes.
And William Boyd, who was Hopalong Cassidy, became a multimillionaire.
Yes,
because he owned the stuff, as you said.
I was watching the Cecil B. DeMille film from '52, The Greatest Show on Earth, the circus movie with Charlton Heston, and who makes a cameo appearance riding his horse in the middle of that movie? Hopalong Cassidy. Kids are yelling, "Hoppy, Hoppy!"
Yeah. Who was his sidekick, guys?
Well, he had a few. He had, I think. Andy Clyde, I think his name was, and then maybe it may have been Gabby Hayes too. Gabby Hayes was all over the place.
Roy Rogers, yeah.
Roy Rogers, yeah. But his horse, this big, beautiful, white horse. But it was interesting about him. He dressed in black, which was unusual because villains are supposed to dress in black.
And gray hair, I think.
He didn't. He would go into a bar. What do you want? He'd say, a sarsaparilla. That's what he wanted. But the most interesting thing for me was that Hopalong Cassidy's television show spawned a radio show. It went just the opposite of most of the shows. After the success of the TV show, they had a radio show. So,
was anybody more successful than Roy Rogers and Gene Autry? And they had TV shows as well.
They did.
Very successful. With the horses, we all knew the names of the horses. We knew the names. Gabby Hayes was Roy Rogers' sidekick, I believe. Gene Autry had who? Was it? It wasn't Andy Devine.
Pat Buttram.
Pat Buttram, who, by the way, if you would ever go to stag luncheons, no one was funnier telling jokes than Pat Buttram, and the jokes were the filthiest jokes I've ever heard in my life.
Well, Steve had mentioned Gunsmoke, and Arthur has, and Gunsmoke started as a radio show, and Matt Dillon was William Conrad, the fat man himself, Jake and the Fat Man, and he tried to be Matt Dillon, but they decided he was a little too heavy to play Matt Dillon.
What a voice!
They also thought of Raymond Burr, but anyhow, John Wayne, of all people, recommended to the producers James Arness, and that's how Arness got the job. But the most interesting fact about Gunsmoke for me is that after 20 years, the cast found out they were canceled by reading it in the trade papers. That's how they found out they were canceled. And what made it interesting for me was that I had met Robin Williams, and talking to him years later, he was so angry at the fact that Mork and Mindy, that he read about it in the trade papers. So somewhere along the line, there's kind of these people should get involved with work and play with others better. And
heartless. Yeah, heartless.
One of the theories that the reason that Westerns were so popular in the 50s and 60s is that people were coming out of World War II, Korean War, Cold War. People were really looking for escapes, and nothing was more escapist than sitting down and watching the Old West transpire. I also think that there was a certain sense of patriotism, that American Westerns were a very unique format. Even though the Italians later made their spaghetti Westerns in Spain and they were following our lead, American Westerns have always been a unique entertainment vehicle from America. And they've translated all over the world. I think that was partially. Also, I think, as Julian pointed out, they were inexpensive. All of the movie lots pretty much had a Western street for their feature Westerns.
Still do, I think.
Yeah. And then, of course, this being Southern California, the land of the sun, there were all sorts of ranches they could film on. A lot of those action sequences were shot at Vasquez Rocks, which is north of Los Angeles, which has that wonderful rocky escarpment. It was all perfect for that. But I think the expense was part of it. I really think that they weren't expensive, and they introduced a lot of new actors. In fact, I read that the producers of Bonanza insisted that the Cartwright family, be a bunch of unknowns. And there was some resistance from the network. They wanted to get some famous faces in there. But back in those days, you could introduce new people.
Well, a lot of stars came out of those Westerns. Whoa.
And that was, in Bonanza's case, that was another reason to keep the cost down. You didn't have to pay for a star. What was interesting to me was to realize how many movie stars turned to the Western, because their careers were not what they had been. And you got people like Henry Fonda and Barbara Stanwyck and Dick Powell and Joel McRae, all of them making Western films.
Yeah.
In fact, The Deputy, which was a Fonda film, was co-written by Norman Lear. Not interesting, huh?
Something that always fascinated me early on, as Julian mentioned, when Monogram and these little film companies had these Westerns that were made for bagels and lox. You'd see them on television. Those are some of the earliest films on TV, late 40s. You'd see these Westerns, and the music in the background, the source music they used were things like Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, William Tell Overture, of course, but you had 100-piece orchestra, the fill. God knows if they ever got paid for them or they even reported it. But that was the source music. To every horse chase, they were using, these great symphonic orchestras. And again, I do wonder if they ever actually paid for that source music, but that's what it was. A lot of movie stars came out of these Westerns, starting with Clint Eastwood, and he was in Rawhide.
And then you had Steve McQueen in Wanted Dead or Alive. In fact, I read something funny. Julian, you probably read the same note. He was offered a key role in The Magnificent Seven, a role that would later make him a star, combined with The Great Escape. But he was also working on Wanted Dead or Alive at the time. So he basically ran his car into a tree on purpose and got all cut up. And the production had to go on hiatus for 3 weeks while he healed up. And then he went off and made The Magnificent Seven.
A clever fellow.
Also,
we have to remember, not only did James Garner come from Maverick, but his cousin Bo Maverick, not Jack Kelly. You know who Bo Maverick was? You guys remember?
Roger Moore.
Roger Moore.
Ah,
there you go. Absolutely. So, a lot of these guys. But I was interested often. We've talked over the years about Ann Sheridan. She actually came back in a show called Pistols and Petticoats. Yeah, it didn't last long, but there she was. So,
we had a movie at United Artists in the 60s, I believe it was, mid-60s, called Support Your Local Sheriff, where the whole gimmick to the movie with Garner was they had all these supporting actor faces, like guys, like every face you could, but you put a name to it. Jack Elam was in thousands of those movies, and so many faces that you would recognize, and it was so successful they made a sequel. Support your local gunfighter.
As I recall, Jack Elam, who had, of course, that wonderful wandering eye of his.
Yeah,
he was an accountant, I guess, and he started acting late in life. He came from accounting, and he was
a shifty-eyed accountant.
A shifty-eyed accountant. A lot of those same actors pop up in the movie version of Maverick. They had Mel Gibson as Brett Maverick, and then if you watch the Back to the Future third chapter, Back to the Future 3, again, a lot of these guys come back in those saloon sequences, including the aforementioned Pat Buttram. That he always had that interesting voice, Patram, that kind of high pitched, whiny voice.
Well, for a lot of our listeners who are really not familiar with Los Angeles or Hollywood, these actors who had faces that you didn't know their names, but they worked all the time, lived in the LA area. And so if you're from LA, you understand that if you live in the Valley, you can drive to the studio every day like you're going 9 to 5, or you can drive from, so many different areas in the Los Angeles suburbs, that you would, it was your job. A friend of mine once referred to Hollywood as Detroit with sun. It was a factory town. It is to this day in many ways. But in those days, a lot of these Westerns, the great character actors who had these faces that we know, but we don't know their names, they would do one show one week, another show another week, a different, there were so many Westerns. They were in all these things. So you knew their faces. You just didn't know who they were. But they lived there. They lived in the factory town.
And, I mentioned earlier that you had all this open space in the Valley and you had, all these faces. But each studio also had their Western department. They, not only did they have the Western Street, but they had the wagons, the horses, all the rigs, the guns. And I know this because I did some research. My very first movie I worked on as a publicist was not a Western per se, although you could say it was more of a modern Western. It was an Alan Rudolph thriller that MGM released in '81 called Endangered Species. We shot it up in Wyoming, but I got to meet the wranglers on that show and a lot of horse wranglers, and they were talking about the old days when every studio could outfit a full Western just from what they had in stock.
It's interesting, too, that we kind of, more modern times, grew up with Murder, She Wrote, that Angela Lansbury herself made sure that all the guest stars were old-time actors who were maybe not doing that well. And it might be Van Johnson one week, you never knew. But Wagon Train did the same thing. Wagon Train first on NBC, then on ABC. But Betty Davis was on Wagon Train. Joseph Cotton, Ronald Reagan's one of his last performances was there. And Lee Marvin was a guest. And Arthur, your friend Seshu Hawakawa, from The Bridge on the River Kwai, and a great silent film star, was also on Wagon Train. So they
have you guys ever heard a comedian named Guy Marks?
Yes,
one of the you have. So
it.
You understand that Guy Marks. A lot of comedians from days gone by were not big stars. Who, like people became Danny Thomas, and so many of those guys became stars. But a lot of those guys were working comics. And Guy Marks did a routine that I would love you and all the people to take a look at on YouTube. You can find it. And he called it Wagon Load, a parody of Wagon Train. Guys, there's nothing funnier for 5 or 6 minutes than Guy Marks doing Wagon Load, and you'll see why. Yeah, you got he's funny just to look at.
I think that the concept of Westerns started to fade a little bit in the mid-'60s. So I think they added the comedy elements. So just like with your feature film, Support Your Local Sheriff, Arthur, that you started to see shows, particularly CBS shows. The Beverly Hillbillies is not a Western, but it begins, in that kind of Western family living in the Ozarks or the Adirondacks. And then you had Petticoat Junction. You had F Troop, which was an hysterical show with Ken Berry and
Larry
Storch and Forrest Tucker.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I worked with Larry Storch at the end of his career. He was a really sweet man. I liked working with him. He replaced Professor Irwin Corey on a play that I was doing. It was kind of good replacement.
Didn't both those guys live to be 100 or plus?
Irwin did. I think Larry
Storch too.
I think very close. If he didn't, it was 98 or 99.
Larry Storch passed away. He passed away 2 weeks before his 100th birthday.
We mentioned Eastwood, and we mentioned McQueen, and we mentioned James Garner and Roger Moore, but we have to mention Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds, not only on Gunsmoke, but on a show with Darren McGavin called Riverboat.
Right.
That was old Burt Reynolds.
Good show.
Plying his trade, yeah. So a lot of these guys got their breaks there. We know Bronson did. We know James Coburn did. I even found that Robert Redford did a Western called Tate, Tate, something I had never heard of. I don't think it lasted long, but Redford
did a lot of TV in the 50s. He was on a lot of those shows, anthology series.
Mike Nichols cast him from watching him on Playhouse 90 in Barefoot in the Park, which was the first time on Broadway he got some real prominence.
Yeah, a lot of those guys like Charles Bronson, Lee Marvin, Redford, many others, they worked television in the 1950s. A lot of those shows became Westerns or whatever but there was a lot of work for actors then, and a lot of those stars came out of. James Coburn was in those things.
A lot of shows opened with a very arresting title sequence. And yes, they got into the song because they all had great songs. The presentation was great. I remember a show called The Rifleman with Chuck Connors, and they always opened with him firing that rifle, rapid fire. It was almost like a machine gun. And it was unusual for a leading character in a Western show to carry a rifle as his main equipment. He didn't have a 6-gun. So I also read recently that The Rifleman was the first show in the history of television to feature a single parent raising a kid. And that was, of course, Johnny. What's Johnny's last name?
Steve, I remember Chuck Connors playing for the Boston Celtics. He was a basketball player, 6'6". and not a great player, but he was noticeable.
Well, that's funny, Arthur, because he also played for the Chicago Cubs. He was a baseball player as well.
Played for the Cubbies for a while, and so he was an athlete before he got into television.
Right,
and he didn't carry a rifle on either team. You know, there was a terrific show when I was a kid again, but a little older now, called "Have Gun Will Travel."
Oh,
with Richard Boone, and "Have Gun Will Travel" was really so interesting. Here was a very Boone playing a very sophisticated man living in the Hotel Carlton in San Francisco. He loved opera. He was very highly educated, and he was almost a combination of Robin Hood and Superman.
Was that Paladin?
Paladin. That was the name. And again, even though he was a good guy, he was dressed in black. The Superman part was that instead of wearing beautiful, expensive suits and great hats, he then turned into Paladin in this black outfit, and he would charge $1,000 to him to go and take care of somebody. That was the Robin Hood part, because if you were poor and in trouble, he didn't charge anything. So that was Richard Boone, who, by the way, was one of the great villains in certain movies. Hombre, he is so mean in Hombre to Paul Newman at the beginning. Of course, we know Paul's not going to take it by the end.
Good actor. Guys, quick response, $1 million, quick response. Who was the actor who became somewhat of a star from playing Wyatt Earp? Quick.
Hugh O'Brien.
That's right.
Yeah, Hugh O'Brien. They claim, but by the way, Desi Lou produced that show, of all people. Desi and Lucy.
By the way, getting back to Have Gun Will Travel, they always featured his business card. If you wanted Paladin, it's Wire Paladin. They gave a number. I always thought his first name was Wire.
Uh-huh.
It's on his business card.
Look how we are now contemporary. Look how big a Western can be on television. Take a look at Yellowstone with Kevin Costner.
Yeah,
that's as big a TV show as you've got. So the public's always had a love affair with Westerns.
Well, I think the idea of a modern Western setting goes back to shows like Dallas. I mean, Dallas was a primetime soap set in Texas, had that kind of Western quality. Yellowstone is very similar, although I think it's a lot more raunchier and grittier.
And before that was the Lonesome Dove. Swept the whole country.
There's been great ones. And How the West Was Won was originally a big MGM Cinerama movie. It also spawned a TV series. I want to talk a little bit about Rod Serling. As you guys know, I wrote the Twilight Zone Encyclopedia. I did a lot of research into Rod's life. After the Twilight Zone was canceled after 5 seasons, Rod sat down and he wrote a Western series which starred Lloyd Bridges called The Loner. It was on for only 1 season. Rod wanted to make a nonviolent Western series. He wanted to have a guy who didn't have to resort to violence to achieve what he needed. Guess how successful that show was?
That's why it was canceled so quickly.
Exactly.
But I think that was one of the first shows that his son, the older son, Bo Bridges, did with him. If I remember,
you're right.
Correctly.
I think you're
Steve,
right.
I was at a Passover Seder last night with a gentleman who went to Cornell and talked a lot about Rod Serling. I didn't know that Rod Serling was brought up in Binghamton, New York. Is that so?
He was born in Syracuse and raised in Binghamton.
Binghamton, New York.
And I went to I went there for a symposium. They have them every so often. And a guy offered to take me out to the house where he was, grew up in. So we go out to the house. A lady comes out, a very nice lady. She offers to take a picture of my friend and I in front of the house. So I hand her my iPhone, and she takes a very nice picture. I look at the picture. It's in black and white. Now, to this day, I have no idea how that worked, because if you want to make a black and white picture on your iPhone, you have to set a thing on the iPhone. So that was a Twilight Zone moment.
Yes, it certainly was. We mentioned Have Gun, and I just want to say that of all the shows that I watched, I couldn't believe the stars on Have Gun. I mean, everybody was on there. Angie Dickinson and Peter Falk. I mean, it was amazing that he had all these people on. Coburn, Lee Van Cleef, Charles Bronson, George Kennedy. They just were all working with Boone. It was interesting that these guys, as we said earlier, all of them started on these Western shows and became huge movie stars.
A dear friend of mine, David Gershenson, may he rest in peace, was the manager of Burt Reynolds, and he managed Burt from the time it all began. We had a movie at United Artists with Burt called Navajo Joe. Not a very good movie. That's while he was working on that Riverboat show. But David described his father was Joe Gershenson, who was the head of music at Universal. And if you ever look at any Universal movies from the 1950s and 60s, you'll always see music director Joe Gershenson. David was brought up in that town. And he spent many, many afternoons after school on the studio, a lot at Universal, and looked at guys like Tony Curtis and Jeff Chandler and oh God, so many of these.
Probably Audie Murphy as well.
Audie Murphy, absolutely. And he talked about how they all would take gun lessons, taking a gun out of a holster and rehearsing for those kind of scenes in Westerns, because Westerns were a staple. But how different the town was, and how all these great actors and actresses we talk about, who were guesting on these various shows. There were so many shows that these people were picking up, a couple of $1,000 this week, $1,500 the next week, just guesting. It was a great industry at that time, and Western, nothing was more successful or abundant than the Westerns. And so,
according to the web, whether it's valid or not, they said from 1949 to late 60s, there were over 100 television Westerns. Amazing. And there is a list if you go on the web, but what's fascinating is you see the name of the show, the cast, and how many episodes. I cannot tell you how many episodes were less than 12. There were 8, 10, 3. Oh, get it off
you categorize Little House on the Prairie as a Western?
Sure.
How long that was on?
That was a long time.
Oh, yeah.
You'd mentioned Rin Tin Tin, Steve. The guy who produced that was a guy named Herbert B. Leonard. We all called him Bert. I guess he didn't like Bert. He liked like Bert. But not only did he produce that show, but he then went on to produce The Naked City and Route 66. So he had quite a run in television, and then went into movies and then disappeared.
Who was the star of Tales of Wells Fargo?
Isn't that Dale Robertson?
Dale Robertson?
Yeah, Dale Robertson. Sure.
Yeah. And who was the star of Whispering Smith?
Ooh, I don't know.
Audie Murphy.
Oh, okay. There you go.
How long did that show last, Off?
12 episodes.
Oh,
Minor.
Yeah.
And then there was a wheel of 3 shows. They rotated each week. One was Cheyenne with
Clint Walker.
Thank you. And then you had Bronco,
right?
Which I'm trying to remember who played the lead on Bronco. It'll come to me in a second. Then Sugarfoot with Will Hutchins. So they were shows. They had a little bit of a wheel, kind of what NBC would later do with their mystery series, including Columbo and all those shows.
Who was in Laramie?
Richard Egan, was it?
Maybe. Who was in The Virginian?
Well, that's Barbara Stanwyck.
No, she was in
Big Valley. She's the Big Valley.
Oh, you're right. That was Big Valley. You're right. The Virginia. I don't remember who was in The Virginia.
James Drury.
That's right.
There you go.
They tried to make a segue to movies. He couldn't. He wasn't able to make that jump.
Oh, there's a whole list in Forest Lawn of those people.
Yes,
who never made it. But nonetheless.
Well, Rawhide was about as popular as look at the music from these shows. Every one of these series had a song that led you into the show. They were great songs. Frankie Lane made a living out of this. Rawhide, as an example, was da 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 rolling. They all had these terrific theme songs that went hand in hand.
And then Clint Eastwood finished the run on that show and just wasn't getting any movie work. That's the primary reason he went over to Europe and started making the spaghetti westerns.
With Sergio Leone.
With Sergio Leone for a few dollars more. Fistful of dollars. Hang 'em High. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Actually, Hang 'em High was not a spaghetti western. You think it was, but actually I believe it was shot here.
No.
Ted Post.
Hang 'em High had a great theme to it, and that was they hung this guy and he comes back to life. He didn't quite kill him. Yeah,
crazy.
Pat Hingle was great in that movie.
Yeah.
Pat Hingle played the judge, the hanging judge.
Yes, the hanging judge.
And then when Milburn Stone died, the doctor on Gunsmoke, Pat Hingle replaced him. He became the doctor on Gunsmoke.
Yeah. Well, we have to discuss Wild Bill Hitchcock.
Hickok. Not Hitchcock. Hickok.
Hitch. Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I call him Wild Bill anyhow.
Wild Bill Hickok I always remember the way he died. He was playing poker and he was holding a hand, aces and eights. And forever that's called the dead man's hand because he was shot at the poker table.
Who was his sidekick on the television show?
Ooh, you know the answer.
His name was Jingles.
Jingles, of course.
And yes. I'll give you a hint. He's in the movie Stagecoach with John Wayne.
Oh, okay.
Andy Devine?
You got it. Arthur, give him the prize, whatever that is.
He was special. Andy
Devine. Here's the thing about Wild Bill Hitchcock.
Hickok.
It started out as a show in syndication. It was sponsored. In those days, a lot of times a sponsor took the whole show. So Kellogg's took old Wild Bill into syndication. It was so successful that the network picked it up, and it was on 2 networks. So it started on radio, then became the syndicated show by Kellogg's. The other show that I remember as a kid was that, believe it or not, Gabby Hayes had a show. He had 2 shows, in fact. And George Gabby Hayes was sponsored by Quaker Oats. So these guys were getting in there early, trying to get the kids to do their Quaker Oats and their Kellogg's.
There was a great line that somebody said they saw a movie the other night that was so old. Gabby Hayes was the bellhop in this movie. There was a movie, you talk about Hopalong Cassidy and merchandising. There was a little TV show called Daniel Boone.
Oh, yeah.
Fess Parker and Ed Ames. And Ed Ames participated in one of the most iconic moments in the history of television when on the Johnny Carson show.
And throws the tomahawk.
He threw a tomahawk into a guy's crotch. Or into the, well, that is a moment
we should say it was a chalk version of a guy.
Not a guy. Right. Yeah. But when he went to he was so embarrassed, he went to get the axe. And Johnny Carson grabs his arm. He had to have that moment. And Carson was perfect, the audience, it was such a scream. And then the screaming let up a bit, and Carson came and said, "And I didn't even know you were Jewish." And then the scream went back up again. What a moment.
Daniel
Ed Ames, as we know, Ed Ames was the lead, or one of the lead singers of the Ames brothers. He was one of the 4 of them. But Ed Ames on Broadway was with Kirk Douglas in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And Ed Ames played Will Sampson's role. He played
the Indian.
The big Native American.
The big Native American, right, of course.
Happen to have a great voice, but I want to just get back one thing. On Daniel Boone, that was a merchandising empire. You guys remember? The kids with the hats and...
Well, the big one, Arthur, was even bigger, was Davy Crockett with Fess Parker.
Davy Crockett, yes.
That was Disney.
Crazy.
That was Disney, and Disney loved Westerns. In fact, a lot of their shows in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, were Western shows. They had a show called Texas John Slaughter with Tom Tryon, and they had a show called The Many Lives of Alfego Baca with, I'm forgetting his name now. He's...
Well, it didn't have many lives, that's for sure.
It didn't have any lives, but he's a wonderful actor. He was in Scarface. He's the first boss of Al Pacino in Scarface. if you remember that person.
Just a little bit of trivia. You guys know what Walt Disney used to do for relaxation at the studio, at his studios, Walt Disney Studios? He would go into the Sherman Brothers office, and the moment he'd go in, they'd sit down, and they'd know he was there, Walt Disney, and they'd start playing these songs from Mary Poppins, and that's how he relaxed. You know, he didn't even have to say play Jim Jimmery, Jim. They just start playing.
Well, he was also famous for going to children's matinees to see what the kids were responding to, which was very interesting. I thought a good way of doing your research.
By the way, I've just come to the conclusion that we've got to do a show on Disney.
Of course.
Okay. All right.
Definitely have to show.
Tell me about Disney Westerns. They did some Westerns, didn't they?
Yeah, no, they did a lot of Westerns. And like I was saying, they did Texas John Slaughter. They did El Fuego Baca. They also did, The Swamp Fox, which was kind of a Revolutionary War Western with Leslie Nielsen as Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. I remember all these shows because I was like 7, 8, 9 years old. I was living on the Disney programming. They had,
didn't they do Old Yeller too?
I think that was theirs too. Yeah, Sunday nights, I believe, was The Wonderful World of Disney. That was a staple on Sunday nights. So you would watch shows on it. They had a series called Spin and Marty, which was with Tim Considine and another actor. It took place on a dude ranch. There were a lot of Western shows there. Of course,
one of the shows we haven't mentioned, and I don't know if you guys saw it, was called The Cisco Kid. Cisco Kid. Fred Ziv was the producer, and Ziv decided to shoot the show in color in the early 50s, which was unheard of because nobody was watching it in color. But he had it in color, and I think probably I see that they say on the web once again incorrectly that Bonanza was the first color Western, and it's not. I mean, I know for a fact that Cisco Kid was shot in color.
By the way, Arthur, I just remembered who was one of the stars of Laramie, Robert Fuller. I just remembered who starred in El Fuego Baca, Robert Loggia.
Yeah.
Who also starred in Big. The movie Big with Tom Hanks.
Dancing on that piano, absolutely.
We haven't mentioned a show that was so big it converted into a very successful movie as well called Wild West.
Oh, yes, Robert Conrad.
Artemis Gordon, maybe?
Artemis Gordon and James West. Not a successful movie, though. Even though Will Smith was in it, it was not a successful movie. It was a huge bomb.
Yeah, it was a bomb, Steve, yeah?
Oh, it was so bad. It was so bad.
Wait. I don't know if we're talking about... Arthur, you're talking about the TV show, I think.
TV show, yes.
Yeah, and Steve's talking about the movie.
Well, no, Arthur said it became a succtive movie, and I was just saying that the Wild West was not a successful. There were 2 movies released the same year based on big TV hits. One was called The Wild Wild West with Will Smith, and the other was The Avengers, which starred Ralph Fiennes and Uma Thurman. And that was also a huge bomb that year.
Let's join the big bombs with the Lone Ranger movie. How's that for a bomb?
That was a humongous bomb, yes. That was a real bomb.
Now we're talking Taka, a real bomb.
But I'd like to clarify, guys, I've just checked.
Okay.
With my genius machine, the Wild West was made for a huge budget of $170 million. That's how much faith they had in it hitting. But it wasn't that much of a bomb because the box office in America was $221 million.
Really?
So you got foreign and you have ancillaries and all the rest. And I'm here to say it probably made money.
I guess I meant to say it was creatively a bomb.
That it was a bad movie. Yeah, that's different. Yeah. Well, sometimes bad movies do business. And sometimes good movies don't do business. So that happens. But The Wild West was a successful TV show, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, it was.
Did he have a career in movies? What was his name?
Robert Conrad. Robert Conrad went on to...
Ross Martin.
And Ross Martin. Robert Conrad went on to do Baba Black Sheep about the Marine Fighter Squadron.
Yes.
And then he just kind of slowly faded away. But on the Wild Wild West, it was kind of one of those shows that was inspired by the James Bond movies. James West was kind of a Western James Bond, and Artemis Gordon, the Ross Martin character, was kind of a man of 1,000 disguises.
Well, speaking of the word wild, we know about Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, but Sam Peckinpah did a show with Brian Keith called The Westerner, where he produced it, he directed it, he wrote it. Didn't last long, but Brian Keith was a fine actor, and Peckinpah kind of made that. And he also had his favorite Kathy Jurado, who he worked with a lot.
And who married who? Who did she marry? Ernest Borgnine.
No, Ethel Merman.
Katie Jurado married Ernest Borgnine.
Katie Jurado married by Ernie Borgnine, who was also married to Ethel Merman for a minute and a half.
Yeah,
and she had one good try and it was over.
And Katie Jurado was,
in High Noon.
Gary Cooper's ex-girlfriend in High Noon.
Yeah, exactly. But the fact that Fatso Judson was able to marry two women that way, it's pretty good. Pretty good.
But remember, he was also the gentle side of Ernest Borgnine was always Marty.
Oh, yes. And also McHale and McHale's Navy.
McHale's Navy, exactly.
One of the great careers in the history of Hollywood.
One of the great guys. I walked out of my dentist one day. I'm standing in the hallway at the elevator bank, and there's Ernie Borgnine. I said, I introduced myself, Mr. Borgnine. I'm a producer. My name is Steve Rubin. He said, when are we going to work?
Ernie Borgnine, I got to meet Ernie, and nice man. And he told me the secret to longevity at the time. He was about 92. The secret to longevity, he says, is in one word. What's that, Ernie? Shtupping. Shtupp and keep shtupping. Go, Ernie. Ernie Borgnine.
Yeah, he's in a Western. He's in a very good Western with Gary Cooper and Burt Lancaster, 1954, Vera Cruz.
Yeah, very good Western.
Well, we have to not forget the fact that some of these folks that we talked about, as we said, really went on to do great things and be quite I guess, big in our business. But whatever happened to Nick Adams? He had a show, remember?
Died young.
The Rebel.
Rebel. The Rebel, yes.
Yeah, he, I think, if I'm not mistaken, committed suicide. Because that's the great movie Rebel Without a Cause. Everybody in that show kind of had a horrible ending. You have Natalie Wood, you've got Dean, Sal Mineo,
everybody.
Even Edward Platt, who played the father or maybe the psychiatrist, he committed suicide.
So Jim Backus went on.
Jim Backus survived.
He went right to Gilligan's Island.
You're right.
Gilligan's Island.
Didn't even pass go. He just kept going.
You guys think Rebel Without a Cause was a great movie?
Oh, yeah.
No, not me. No,
not me. Not me.
I just like the casting. I think it's
the cast was great. Yeah,
casting.
And it was a big hit. Boy, was it a hit!
It was.
One of these days, we ought to explain to our listeners how the hell James Dean became the legend that he was, and died before any of his movies were released.
Well, first of all, when you die young and are famous, you generally live.
But Julian, he was a legend. He was a legend while he was living, and none of the movies were released.
Well, no, I think East of Eden had come out.
No, it had not.
Well,
but Rebel Without a Cause.
One of them had. One of them definitely did.
I don't believe any of them came out.
No, Rebel Without a Cause came out.
Definitely. It did? Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely.
But no, your point is still valid, which is this guy has lived on and on and on. But in the merchandising world, a lot of the people who die young are the ones who often live on.
Now, he was great in a movie called Giant. Not that I love the movie,
which is kind of a modern Western. Speaking of merchandising, I want to say that I once had a model replica of Steve McQueen's gun in Wanted Dead or Alive. And do you remember what the nickname of his gun was?
No.
I can't say it's on the tip of my tongue.
His gun was called the Mare's Leg. It was a sawed-off Winchester, and that was his gun of choice.
we have to remember our ex-president was on for many, many years on Death Valley Days.
Death Valley
there
Days.
he was. He's sitting there for years and years, and then who comes in after him? You guys remember? A huge movie star, Robert Taylor.
Robert Taylor.
Yeah. So
Didn't remember that at all.
Yeah, that's true.
There was a series once about that same era called 20 Mule Team. Wasn't that the name of the series? Was there a show called 20 Mule Team? Or was that the brand of borax that was sponsoring some other show?
Now you're getting closer. Now you're getting warmer.
I think Death Valley Days was sponsored by 20 Mule Team, which was a brand of borax. There you go.
I think you're absolutely right. And don't forget Dick Powell's Zane Grey Theater, which was a very successful show. Very successful. Dick not only hosted it, produced it, part of Four Star, but I think starred in many of the shows himself. Yeah.
Had another huge career. Who was in Walker?
Oh, that's Chuck Norris. You mean Walker, Texas Ranger?
That's right.
Yeah, that's Chuck Norris. Big hit. And then John Russell, a very tall actor that did a lot of character parts, he took a show called Lawman.
That was on for a while. Yeah.
Wasn't he in Rio Bravo?
Yes, he played the bad guy. He played Claude Aiken's brother, who was the big landowner. Absolutely. And then another Western, which kind of veered more into the comedy side, was The Real McCoys with Walter Brennan.
Yes. Yeah, produced by Danny Thomas, by the way.
Produced by Danny Thomas.
And Walter Brennan was the star. And I was at ABC when that show was on. And I left, and so did the show.
I think he went on to be on another Western show called The Guns of Will Sonnet.
That's right.
It's also Walter Brennan.
Want to hear a great what if? Here's a what if. What if John Wayne, if they found a TV series Western for John Wayne who would appear every week, how big would that have been? John Wayne on television weekly.
Well, the producers of Gunsmoke wanted John Wayne. That's how James Arness got the part. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Arness got the part. James Arness and John Wayne appeared together in a film called Islands in the Sky.
I like the movie.
Yeah, good movie. Good airplane rescue movie. And I think that was at the time.
Who directed that, Steve?
Islands in the Sky.
It's kind of an important director. I forget who.
I can't remember, but I know it was released about the same time as The High and the Mighty. Big airline thing.
Right.
Can I bring up a couple Westerns that I know of? That's a little more modern, actually.
Please.
Go ahead, Mike.
Back in the late 90s, there was a show. It was called The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr. It was on Fox. It actually was it had only one season. A lot of shows on Fox at that time was basically it was a take kind of the Wild Wild West stories and everything. And so they used technologies and stuff with it. Started Bruce Campbell, actually. And it was very, very popular for a bit. Then, of course, there was on HBO, there was a show called Deadwood.
Oh, yes. Larry Gelbart said that's the best written show he'd seen in years. He said,
and they used all the expletives they couldn't use on 3,000 Westerns beforehand popped up on Deadwood, from what I hear.
Oh, very much so. Very, very much so. Then the other two that I had on my list for this there was a very short-lived science fiction show on Fox. It was called Firefly. And it was basically a Western in space. And that was a Joss Whedon production. And that only lasted 13 episodes, but they also made a major film off of it also. And Firefly was very, very, very popular. After it ended, it became even more popular than it was when it aired. And then the other one is more recent. I think it's about 2010. It was a modern take on Westerns, and it was called Justified.
Oh, sure, with Timothy Oliphant.
Yes. And it basically, he was a modern cowboy, but he was a lawman. He was a U.S. Marshal. But it took place in Kentucky instead of the Old West. And it was an amazing show.
I want to mention two more shows that I remember as a kid. Another one, I remember Rin Tin Tin because there was a dog. Then there was a show called Fury, which was all about a horse. That stuck in my mind. And then there's this little show, it was more of a modern Western called Sky King.
Oh,
and he had an
Kirby
airplane.
Grant. Yes.
Kirby Grant had an airplane. You remember what the name of the airplane was?
No idea.
A Songbird.
Songbird.
Should have known that. You can imagine the industry of what it was like to have all the horses in L.A. at that time and in Hollywood around the studios. That was an industry unto itself. So many westerns, so many horses.
People used to ride their horses through the canyon to Paramount Pictures in those days from the Valley. A lot of us who grew up in West LA or LA didn't go to the Valley much, but people had ranches out there and they rode their horses to work.
I'll give you a cast on a show that I never heard of. It was called Frontier Justice. Lou Ayres, Melvin Douglas, and Ralph Bellamy.
Wow.
Didn't last long. Hell of a good, interesting cast. And
great cast from the 1930s.
Yeah. And once again, these shows did not last, but they sure kept trying. They kept trying. You think of that 100 shows from that 10, 12 period. It's amazing.
Julian, early television, what was the show that Ralph Bellamy was in about a...
Man Against Crime.
That's right. Very good.
Yeah. And by the way, they put it out again, and they called it Follow That Man. I have no idea why. I have no idea. It's like Bonanza. Bonanza came back on NBC as the Ponderosa. Same show, but they kind of reran it again. It's interesting days of early television.
And Dan Blocker, who played Haas on Bonanza, he opened a chain of restaurants called the Ponderosa.
Oh.
I think they're still around, Ponderosa Steakhouses, absolutely.
And let us not underestimate, again, to bring it up, the songs that came from these shows. Some of them were huge hits.
Well, sing one for us, Arthur. You're the only qualified singer here. Sing one.
No, well, I can tell you that Daniel Boone was a big hit song. Daniel Boone was a man. And I forget who sang it, but it was a big hit record.
Oh,
but
here I go. Here I go off. Davy Crockett,
yeah.
King of the wild frontier. Born on a mountaintop in Tennessee. Never mind.
Joel Gray, great Joel Gray's father was a Yiddish comedian named Mickey Katz, a very, very significant actor from the Yiddish theater. And he did a parody on the Davy Crockett called Mazel Tov David Crockett. And it was a hit. And I think Julian mentioned earlier, he did something also on, was it Ghost Riders or something?
I think Ghost Riders in the Sky, on Vaughn Monroe's song. He was quite a funny guy, and I liked him a lot. Listen, just quickly, this is what happens when you're a kid. With his faithful Indian companion Tonto, the daring and resourceful masked rider of the plain, led the fight for law and order in the early West. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. The Lone Ranger rides again.
Very good.
I don't know what I had for breakfast, but I can do that.
Well, see, it's in those days, presentation was much more careful. Today, they are so nervous about timing. They won't give you a title sequence anymore. How many shows today have title sequences?
Why is that, though, Steve?
Well, on network television, they're trying to save time for commercials. In terms of the cable universe, I have no idea why they don't have an illustrative title sequence. I mean, we love title sequences. We certainly love music. Mike, we turn it over to you.
Thank you, my friends. As always, thanks for listening to the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you guys. Please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you could also find Tales from Hollywoodland wherever fine podcasts are found. Now you can even find us up on YouTube with our own channel up there at no extra cost. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Before we get out of here, let's check with the guys and see what's happening on their weekly podcast. Julian, what do you got going on right now?
Oh, I've got Martin Sheen coming up, talking about Apocalypse Now, his relationship with Brando, his early days in the business. Wonderful man, and the guy, of course, who we knew as the president on The West Wing.
Awesome.
And Steve, what do you got, Steve?
Well, if anybody's always wondered how people become talent agents, I have Alan Gassmer as my guest, and Alan actually made my first 2 movie deals. The movies didn't get made, but he made the deals. And we talk about his journey from being from an agent to a manager to a producer. He executive produces the Vikings television series.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
And we should mention, Mike, that on a show that we're having soon, we're going to do a show on Elvis, and that's going to be great stuff.
Oh, of course, of course. On behalf of Steve, Arthur, and Julian, thanks again for listening to Tales from Hollywoodland. This has been your announcer, Mike Faber. We'll see you here next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. Peace.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.
And we're done.
We cordially invite you to experience the SoulForge podcast.
On SoulForge, we chat about movies, books, and pop culture,
Sex, love, and dating.
travel and adventure.
Mental health issues.
We have interviews with musicians, authors, entrepreneurs, and other random weirdos. Join Sean
And Leah.
and the occasional animal interruption on the SoulForge podcast.
Be a better human with the SoulForge podcast.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.